I apologize for nothing.
This is very college radio.
Were we fair with our depiction of college radio?
Absolutely. I mean, you hit right on this idea of the fragmentation that college radio perhaps helped foment, and kind of the current landscape that it sits within now, which it's still weird. It's still out there. It's still amateur. It's still populated with all these music freaks looking for something new, but it's not the only game in town anymore, so to speak. And I see some questioning of the nostalgia trap that I definitely had to go through as somebody who is an alum of college radio. I
just did a show with another professor friend of ours and writer who just started his own publishing house, Mike Watson. His book is called Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, which is about the trap of nostalgia in digital capitalism. I don't know if you saw this recently. The Gen Xers, men Conan and I's age, have overtaken children as the #1 purchasers of action figures. So nostalgia and the internet
I have no idea what you're talking about, sir.
It's working, right? It's working.
That's not even all of them, by the way.
So this show on college radio, which I think, I don't know how this is going to go over with a lot of people that watch this show. Is it going to be a trip down memory lane for these guys, which it will be, or is it going to be a real materialist approach? From your introduction, it felt like you didn't want to have that kind of love affair with 80s college radio, which is where everybody kind of stays when that whole they're a college radio band, the college radio charts come to be.
How many shows were called Left of the Dial after that?
What made you want to go deeper? Is it just the fact that you are a historian and you have to go deeper?
Yeah. So the sad story is my alma mater, it's right behind me, which I had a great education. But I was a college DJ at Vanderbilt, and this is the late 90s. I was a history major. I was an anthropology major. And I went off and did that. And I was into like policy and like just really like kind of wonky political history. And that's what I went off and did. But then in 2011, Vanderbilt sold our radio station. And so Vanderbilt still very much touts the fact that they have radio and podcasting, but they no longer have an FM signal, which was a 19,000 watt powerful signal in Music City, Nashville, that was deeply connected, sometimes problematically, to the wider community. Sometimes, there are lots of things that happen at the station over time. And so I started to question, well, why is it that I'm so heartbroken at this FM signal disappearing in what appears to be this era when it doesn't really matter as much anymore to have access to radio? I argue now that it does. And so I started delving into, well, where do these stations even come from? How bizarre is it that a bunch of university administrators ever let 18, 19, 20-year-olds have the reign of radio stations?
Yeah, right.
With a reach of like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in some cases. And so I started delving into, all right, well, what were the politics? What were the regulatory origins of these things? And then how did college radio become this thing? And what I ended up realizing is that 80s moment, it was so short-lived of a time, and that college radio, rather than being this kind of perfect little refuge outside of the mainstream, was always this place of conflict where politics was happening. And, the 80s, it's no accident that college radio assumes this really beloved position in the mindsets of Gen Xers in particular, but in the 1980s and the 1990s, when you have these national culture wars raging, because it's a place where people found like they could have some access to media. They could have some say in the sounds that shaped their daily lives, because, as y'all are noticing, that access, that media scarcity, was a real thing. I think we in our wealth of digital access now, we kind of forget how hard it was to get access to music, or even just
Yes.
knew, what the next thing was going to be.
I mean, I still think it's hard to get access to music. It's just everywhere. I just don't know what's cool, what's not, because I can
Filters, right? Filters.
it's
That's what it's
really
about.
hard. Like, because I'm such a small person on Spotify, it'll tell you like, "Oh, you like this band? Here's another piece of shit band that no one listens to. You might dig them too." And, I started my recommendation started to be other smaller bands. And so I started saying, "Oh, some of these guys are really good." And that kinda takes me back to this moment of tuning into Calex any time of day,
Yeah.
and you were going to hear random music. And some people did workout shows, right? As we got older, especially in the 90s, there were like hip hop shows and stuff like that. Like, I'm gonna play this kind of music that I dig. But as you talk about it in the book, college radio is devoid of the traditional radio format of the daytime guy and the drive time guy. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, college radio is really dominated by the block format, which develops really in the 1970s as basically what we think of as public radio, and what becomes NPR, and the kind of the syndicated kind of highbrow educational stations that starts to diverge from what we think of as educational radio or college radio. I also kind of include community radio in conversation with college radio, because it's a certain way of doing radio that also uses a block format. And those stations, there might be a day parting kind of structure to some. It kind of runs the gamut of stations on the left hand of the dial that have these educational licenses between 88.1 and 91.9, although there's commercial college stations as well. There's AM, there's carrier current still throughout this era. But that block format begins to be a place where these upcoming genres of music that aren't getting played on commercial radio at all get a foothold. And so it starts out being just anything alternative to what's on commercial FM, as those stations like the WBCNs of the world, which is the big Boston commercial, which was very freeform and really, they're the ones primarily playing freeform in the 60s and 70s. They start to format in the mid 70s. And so colleges and those stations become the ones that are more freeform. But what that really meant is that they would divide up the blocks into whatever DJs wanted to play. So you could be freeform, but you might still have a formatted show. You might be playing Haitian Creole news programs, or religious broadcasts on Sunday morning, or gospel music, or jazz, or folk, anything that didn't have enough of an audience to justify a commercial signal, a demographic, that would appeal to advertisers. And so it's that alternativeness of the 1970s that provides the space for, say, a punk show to come on very, very, very late at night. We might think that college radio had this kind of perfect symbiosis with punk, but it took a while actually for punk to get a real foothold and association with the kind of aesthetic of college radio. And a lot of college DJs in the late 1970s, they wanted to still kind of, get the let out and play classic rock or Styx, but they just might be playing, the next cut off the record or the B-side. They still wanted to sound kind of like top 40, and they really clashed with the punks and the new wavers, and eventually the hardcore shows and that kind of thing. So the block schedule, and basically just giving somebody 2 hours to kind of play around with radio, was how college radio develops this reputation. That's not to say that these stations didn't have rules. Obviously, the FCC provides some rules, but some stations might have a heavy, medium, and light rotation. They might emphasize new music. They might have a show devoted totally to local music. That really varied based on where you were and what station and whatever mission you were tied to with the university. And that's kind of the amazing part of this educational radio thing, that administrators allowed this to go on because students were getting hands-on experience. They were running these things, getting that kind of experience running the board, being on air, selling ads in some cases, or underwriting, or just managing people or working with record labels. They saw it as educational, but they also saw it as a way of connecting their academic programs to the wider public. And so there's always this tension between kind of the town and gown service of these signals because they occupy the public airwaves. And so people outside of the university also have a claim to these stations. They're there to be educational, to have a public service function, which gives listeners in surrounding areas like a real say, or at least sense that they should have a say in what's going on. And that's really what generates a lot of the controversy at these stations, and why I consider them a real site of the culture wars in the 80s and the 90s. Because rather than these stations staking out some kind of outpost on one side of the culture wars, it's actually a place where all of these different people can come together and try to figure out, what do we value collectively as a community in a location, in a kind of hyper local environment? What is that soundscape gonna be like? What's it gonna sound like? Who's gonna get purchase on that? And that's where you get the real fights of college radio. It was a very emotional place sometimes,
Right.
and it wasn't always administrators who were causing the controversy.